Welcome to Under the Radar, where we study the etymology of Western ideas. That is, not so much what they mean as where they've come from. I'm Kirk Powell. As a genre, fiction has come to dominate our libraries and bookstores, and I don't just mean in terms of space, but also in terms of effort and consideration. Some friends and I visited a local library recently where there were several fiction categories clearly marked, but when we moved across to the nonfiction section, which was barely marked, we found that it was also not categorized. You might find on the same rack a book about Norse poetry and about Southern cooking. It just didn't matter. Besides that, there have been any number of times when my own interest in nonfiction literature has required me to hunt around in a small, out-of-the-way corner of any number of bookstores. But why has fiction taken over? Our knee-jerk reaction might be that nonfiction literature is either difficult or boring. However, difficulty is not something unique to nonfiction. There are works of nonfiction that are deliberately easy, and works of fiction that are deliberately obscure. The same is true of boredom. Personal experience will bring to our minds fantastically boring works of fiction, and given that it is an aphorism that truth is stranger than fiction, it seems unlikely that nonfiction is bound always to be more boring than fiction. A friend of mine once told me that he had trouble concentrating on fictional literature because a little voice in his head kept telling him, "None of this really happened." For him, the unreality of fiction as a genre made it, in a manner of speaking, quite boring. So what's the real reason why book venues are swamped with fiction? Let me make one suggestion that seems likely to me. Relativism has worked its way into all sorts of aspects of Western life. Depending on your interests, religious relativism might come to your mind first, but the idea that that is okay for you and this is okay for me is seen in many areas of life. In literature, we see this in reader response theory, wherein the meaning of a text is generated by the reader, not the author. In fact, the meaning of the author is sometimes presented as something inaccessible, not merely obscure, but actually unknowable. I believe it is this sort of relativistic mindset that has relegated nonfiction to dusty neglect. In the West, we have largely given up on the idea that it is possible to communicate meaningful truth to one another. Media claiming to communicate truth, whether classrooms or news networks, predominantly do so in the form of neatly factual information. Names, dates, actions, places, whatever ideas are at work are typically buried either in unspoken assumptions or deliberate disavowal. I suspect that this is what people really mean when they say that nonfiction literature is difficult or boring. They mean that it is embarking on a useless, impossible task. If modern Westerners think of ideas as basically unreal or unattainable, this is a huge change from earlier Western thinking, in which ideas were, if anything, even more real than the physical world. Furthermore, if Westerners conceive of fictional literature as a safe haven to escape the world of ideas, this too is a significant change. Just a couple hundred years ago, some of the most prominent philosophers of their era sought to express their ideas through fiction. In the final analysis, the contemporary West shows little interest in nonfiction, not because it's hard to read and not because it's boring, but because we think of it as a doomed project, a waste of time. Next time on Under the Radar, we study silence.